I went down to Sammy's bar. Hey, the last boats are leaving by the shore at Pietar. Call away the days old. And my real love, she was there. Hey, the last boats are leaving, and the sand was in her hair. Call away the days old. How did sand get in your hair? Hey, the last boats are leaving. Darling Johnny, put it there. Call away the days old. He's a better man by far. Hey, the last boats are leaving, 'cause he's got a Yankee card. Call away the days old. I went out from Sammy's bar. Hey, the last boats are leaving, and to buy a Yankee card. Call away the days old. 14 weeks I drank no wine. Hey, the last boats are leaving, saving for that love of mine. Call away the days old. Then one day in Palace Square, hey, the last boats are leaving. At a headline I did stare. Call away the days old. Johnny tried a hairpin bend. Hey, the last boats are leaving. To my love he made an end. Call away the days old. I went back to Sammy's bar. Hey, the last boats are leaving. I don't need a Yankee card. Call away the days old.
Please join me in welcoming the best. Stan Rogers.
Thank you. Okay. All set. I rise up every morning at 7:45. Some woman who's my wife tells me not to be late. I kiss the kids goodbye, I can't remember their names. And week after week, it's always the same. And it's, oh boys, can't you code it and program it right? Nothing ever happens in this life of mine. I'm hauling up the data on the Xerox line. Yeah. And it's coding the data, give the keyboard a punch, then cross, correlate, and a break for some lunch. Correlate, tabulate, process, and screen. Program, print out, regress to the mean. And it's, oh boys, can't you code it and program it right? Nothing ever happens in this life of mine. I'm hauling up the data on the Xerox line. Yeah, 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 yeah. Then it's home again, eat again, watch some TV, make love to your woman at 10:53. I dream the same dream when I'm sleeping at night. I'm soaring over hills like an eagle in flight. And it's, oh boys, can't you code it and program it right? Nothing ever happens in this life of mine. I'm hauling up the data on the Xerox line. Yeah, 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 yeah. Someday I'm gonna give up all the buttons and things. I'll punch that time clock till it can't ring. Burn up my necktie and set myself free. Cause no one's gonna fold, bend, or mutilate me. And it's, oh boys, can't you code it? Woo! And program it right. Nothing ever happens in this life of mine. I'm hauling up the data on the Xerox line. And it's, oh boys, can't you code it and program it right? Nothing ever happens in this life of mine. I'm hauling up the data on the Xerox line. There's a spot far away, we all know well, a place that's called the Lookout Hill, where the rabbits hop, the wildcats yell, and how I love that place no one can tell. There are trout streams there, and moose and deer, but you never lay eyes on a grizzly bear. Stick your back up on your back and head your way up the lookout track. There'll be a time when I am old and my poor old bones are stiff and cold. I'll head to the lookout with the setting sun, and when I smell those spruce trees I'll feel young. When the lakes are frozen, the creeks are high, and you hear the owl in the moonlight cry, I'll head to the lookout with spirits high. Goodbye, my friend, it's there I'll die. There's a spot far away, we all know well, a place that's called the Lookout Hill, where the rabbits hop, the wildcats yell, and how I love that place no one can tell.
Hello, my friends. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the stream. Can I get some confirmations in chat that the sound is coming through all right before I continue on? Anybody just confirm for me that the microphone sounds good? Because we've had some issues in the past. How's the sound? Okay. Symphony says it sounds good. Great. So today, I want to give you an overview of a sort of historical theory that I've been working on lately, that I've been pondering, and it was inspired by something that Schwab said, Real Human Schwab, said on his Substack in an older article called Theater Kid Occupied Government. So I'm going to drag over here to the screen now. Make sure my frame is good. Yep. So in his article, Theater Kid Occupied Government, he talks about the world's fairs. And he says, I'll just read. However, the last Great Reset, referring to the whole idea of the World Economic Forum, Great Reset that's slated to happen, is happening right now. The last Great Reset, similar to the one we are experiencing today, occurred sometime between 1850 and 1900. The exact dates are impossible to pin down due to lack of records. Regardless, we can see the evidence of large-scale stagecraft in the form of the world's fairs. Quote from Paul Greenhalgh. The world's fairs were intended to distract, indoctrinate, and unify a population. As the electorate swelled toward the turn of the century, these three intentions swelled also, their realization being hoped for through concentration on particular themes. Perhaps the single most persistent of these was that of empire, as it contained all the political, commercial, and social ingredients capable of preserving the progressive liberal order of things. And we're going to read the rest of this once it comes up in the timeline of this theory. But this got me thinking, of course, the elites and the way that the current rulers operate and have operated for centuries now has always been to extract order out of chaos, to create a crisis, and use the crisis as an excuse, as a starting point, as an opportunity to create a new order of things. So I started wondering, what was the crisis? What led up to the world's fairs? Can we find a logical progression of things that shows that perhaps there was a grand plan that was being executed, and that the world's fairs were sort of just one stage in this grand plan? What chaos was created to justify and create the conditions wherein this new order of things that was being constructed in the world expositions, in the world's fairs? What chaos, what crisis laid the foundations for this to be accepted by the people? So I started looking into it, and it turns out, just to give the theory in brief, and then we'll get into all the details. It appears that in the late 18th century, the late 1700s, the flourishing of secret societies among the new industrial, financial, and economic elite, the flourishing of these secret societies, I believe, was the kernel or the beginning of the creation of a century-long plan. So we have the secret societies in the late 1700s that were all surrounding industrialists, leading financialists, leading scientists, all these the players that would become the new aristocracy were all getting together in these groups, these secret clubs, these secret societies. And we have to wonder, what was their grand plan? What were they actually getting together to plan? Because I'm sure these people had amazing forethought. They were capable more than anybody else of planning decades or centuries ahead. So the question becomes, what was the plan? Then we have to start looking at what happened immediately following this flourishing of secret societies. And just, people doubt the possibility that projects can be planned decades and centuries ahead of time. But, when you look, where is it that I found? When you look at the existence, like it's undeniable. Where's my tab? I'm going to put a new image behind me. When you look at a list of... Oh, I lost it. Here we go. When you look at a list of just building projects, things like the Great Wall of China took 2,000 years to complete. Things like Petra took 850 years to complete. Okay? Buildings like York Minster Cathedral, 252 years to complete. People are capable of planning projects that take hundreds of years. And this is just in construction. So you have to wonder what social engineering projects have been conceived that last decades or hundreds of years. And I would say that what was happening at the end of the 1700s was in these secret society meetings, they weren't planning short-term projects. They were planning very long-term, long-scale projects. Okay, so the Illuminati, for example, they were all about infiltrating the Freemasonic clubs. They were flourishing in the late 1700s. Then you have the Lunar Society, I think is one of the biggest. The Lunar Society of Birmingham. Let me adjust my tab here. The Lunar Society of Birmingham, who, by the way, Dr. Deep State has talked about in the past. If you look up Dr. Deep State's videos, he has some on the Lunar Society. They were, like it says here, a dinner club of informal learned society of prominent figures in England, including industrialists, natural philosophers or scientists, intellectuals, political theorists. They would all meet during a full moon. It's very esoteric, very mystical in their whole setup here. And, all the big names of industry, of political theory, of trade, international trade, of science at the time. All of these people were getting together, and they were from all over Europe. This wasn't restricted only to English people, even people like Benjamin Franklin here. Europe, America, all over the place, they were all getting together. And so the question was, what were they planning? What was their plan? And I'm going to give you my hypothesis, my what I think is a good assumption, I guess, as to what their plan was. I think their plan began, or let me just say, I think their plan was a precursor to something that I've discussed in the past in this particular video right here, World War II and forced industrialization. If you haven't watched this video, you can go watch it, where I explain how World War II was the final catalyst of urbanization, of destruction of the rural, natural lifestyle of Europe. And I think that what happened was a precursor to World War II. It was the first sort of rinse. Took multiple rinsings, multiple hosings to make this happen in Europe, to really purify, in a sense, to reconstruct Europe. And this first stage was the Napoleonic Wars. I believe the Napoleonic Wars, which were a major international, basically a world war, essentially, among the great powers of Europe. I believe the Napoleonic Wars were, in some sense, planned. And they were planned to decimate the existing order of things, to create a new order. And as a first bit of evidence here, a lot of people in our circles who are pro-European, especially people who just start to get into pro-European, pro-white thinking, they look to our history and they see people like Napoleon, and they view him with reverence, with awe. They're inspired by him because he's a figure of strength, a figure of order, of European pride. But what if I told you that it's a good possibility that Napoleon was Jewish? And this is not something that is sort of a recent idea. Even 19th century figures such as Disraeli, the Prime Minister of England, believed that Napoleon was Jewish. Other historians of the 19th century, such as Michelet or Michelet, believed that Napoleon was Jewish. And if you read, I'm not going to read this because it's just way too long, but if you read Miles Mathis's work on Napoleon, he gives a lot of good reasons to believe that he actually was. And if he was Jewish, it's a good assumption that he was a part of this new, up-and-coming financial, industrial aristocracy that was aiming to destroy the old order, what they called the ancient regime, the old order of Europe. And this is something that Napoleon explicitly says. I mean, he says explicitly at the end of his career, "I closed the gulf of anarchy and brought order out of chaos." That is, the whole order out of chaos statement is not a random statement. That's something that, it's a signal, I think. Ordo ab chao. That is like a motto of this ruling elite that we have today. He brought order out of chaos. I rewarded merit regardless of birth or wealth, wherever I found it. I abolished feudalism and restored equality to all religion and before the law. I fought the decrepit monarchies of the old regime, the ancient regime, the old world order. Because the alternative was the destruction of all this, I purified the revolution. You notice the alchemical vocabulary here. I purified it. I brought order out of chaos. I restored equality. I reward regardless of birth or wealth. So we have sort of a proto existence of these sort of new progressive liberal ideas being espoused by Napoleon. And the Napoleonic Wars were extraordinarily devastating. And whenever you see something like, whenever you're looking at an event in history, by the way, I'm going to interact more with the chat in just a second. Hop Up Perspective, it's good to see you. Whenever you see a major event in history that is hard to explain, you always have to question who benefits. Qui bono, right? And the Napoleonic Wars were considered the first major total war in European history. It says, historians have explored how the Napoleonic Wars became total wars. Most historians argue that the escalation in size and scope came from two sources. First was the ideological clash between revolutionary/egalitarian and conservative/hierarchical belief systems. Okay, so this is the difference here. This was the battle at hand. Revolutionary egalitarian on the Napoleonic side, and conservative/hierarchical on the opposition. Second was the emergence of nationalism in France, Germany, Spain, and elsewhere that made these people's wars instead of contests between monarchs. Bell, an historian, has argued that even more important than ideology and nationalism were the intellectual transformations in the culture of war that came about through the Enlightenment. One factor, he says, is that a war was no longer a routine event. Okay, this is important here. It was no longer a routine event, but a transforming experience for societies, a total experience. Secondly, the military emerged in its own right as a separate sphere of society distinct from the ordinary civilian world. The French Revolution made every civilian a part of the war machine, either as a soldier through universal conscription or as a vital cog in the home front machinery, supporting and supplying the army. Out of that, says Bell, came militarism, the belief that the military role was morally superior to the civilian role in times of great national crisis. So here we have, once again, great crises. Crisis. Like in the COVID era, a big crisis ushers in a fundamental change in society. Okay. So it is a fact that millions upon millions of people died in the Napoleonic Wars. Just as many people probably in the Napoleonic Wars as in World War II. And this was at a time when Europe had a lower population in general. So it was devastating. And since it was a total war, they decimated infrastructure. They decimated civilian, basic civilian infrastructure. And not only that, but it brought just about every young man who was able into this new way of life, this urban, militaristic way of life. And it recruited just about everybody else who was able to become a part of this new industrial, urban war machine. So it's not a surprise, or it shouldn't be a surprise, that the result of this was a massive flood of people from the countryside into the cities after the conclusion of the war. Okay, here's to show you the devastation of this war. You can just look at the disasters of war by Goya. And I know these illustrations were done in Spain, but I think it's reasonable to assume that this type of devastation was also present everywhere else that the war happened. And just, if you have time at some point, go through some of these illustrations of the disasters of war by Goya and really try to put yourself into the mindset, put yourself into that experience. An elderly woman, look at this one. It's called No Quieren. They do not want to. An elderly woman wields a knife in defense of a young woman who is being assaulted by a soldier. Imagine if that's your grandma. And the woman is your wife. And the man is some foreign soldier. And you're lying on the ground after being bayoneted through the lung. Imagine the devastation, the psychological impact. These are the types of things that open up the void, open up the abyss, chaos, and allow for people to be traumatized into a mindset where they're willing to accept any solution, where they're willing to accept any way out. This one's particularly horrible. Esto es peor. This is worse. In the aftermath of battle, the mutilated torsos and limbs of civilian victims, were mounted on trees like fragments of a marble sculpture. The hanging. So, just imagine that trauma that was inflicted on the psyche of the European people. There are accounts that you can actually read here if you want to look them up. The devastation of the Napoleonic Wars, according to a British officer. First-hand accounts of how devastating this war was. People talk about this guy says, I've read a few accounts of the Battle of Leipzig in 1813 and its impact on the local population. This aspect really deserves more publicity. Documentaries about anything prior to World War II usually focus on the military events only. The scale of devastation in the Napoleonic Wars alone makes me terrified of what happened in the 30 Years' War. Okay? So it was horrible. And so what happened immediately following the Napoleonic Wars was what's called in at least German history in particular, Landflucht, flight from the land, which refers to the mass migration of peasants into the cities that occurred in Germany. If you look at the statistics here, this is the rate of urbanization in Europe in 1800, just before the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleonic Wars was about 1804 to 1815. And in 1800, as you can see, really the only urbanized countries were England, Scotland, Belgium, and the Netherlands, but Germany, France, Austria were still highly rural, extremely rural. But here, to show you some actual numbers, the share of urban oh, here, it's Didymus. Welcome, Didymus. Glad to see you. The share of urban population in various European countries and regions at different time points during the 19th century. So when you look at Germany in particular, from 1800 to 1850, the urban population doubled. And then it more than doubled again from 1850 to 1890. In France, it also just about doubled from 1800 to 1850. Everywhere here you see a massive uptick, except for in like the Netherlands, which was already very rural, very urbanized. Scandinavia pretty much escaped that trend up until the later half, but especially in Germany and France, and Spain to some extent, there was a massive upshift in urbanization that occurred in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. And so what I think happened was, what I find interesting about this first wave into the urban areas by these peasants was a phenomenon called the Biedermeier era. I find this particularly interesting because the Biedermeier era shows that this first wave of peasants that fled into the cities for the number of reasons that I explained, okay, as the countryside was devastated, young men, young women, young people in general were becoming conditioned to an urban industrial lifestyle by their conscripting by being conscripted into the army in this total war, and this newly initiated middle class that blossomed out of this during this era. You can see in their artistic and aesthetic sensibilities that they were still, in their minds, they were still ultimately normal peasant people. And this even is reflected in the very term of Biedermeier, which means sort of uplifted average person. If you look at the etymology, I know I saw it somewhere. anyway, just take my word for it. Meyer is like, it's basically like average Joe, and Bieder means like upright or lifted up, if I recall correctly. And you can see in their sensibilities. Okay, the Biedermeier period is described as a period of conservatism in art between 1815 and 1848, during which the middle class grew in number and the arts appealed to common sensibilities. It began with the Congress of Vienna at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and ended with the onset of the revolutions in 1848. It says here, the two driving forces for the development of the period, or there were two driving forces. One was the growing urbanization and industrialization, leading to a new urban middle class. And the other was the political stability prevalent under Clemens von Metternich following the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So you have this blossoming of a new middle class, a newly initiated middle class that was essentially still provincial, that was still sort of country, sort of maintaining their natural, traditional sensibilities. And you could see it in the subject matter of their paintings. They liked to paint domestic, non-political, sort of idyllic scenes of well-dressed families going on walks in nature. It was a time when landscape paintings were in vogue. They liked to decorate their homes in this sort of warm, woody, they like to use nice wood paneling all over the place. The image that I was using before for my background was a Biedermeier. Not this one. This one. It's warm, it's homely, it's gemütlich. They liked to just paint families, well-dressed families, having parties, having ceremonies, engaged in, these old rural country lifestyle types of activities. And this period between 1815 and 1848, I think, was sort of a purgatory period for these people. It was a period where this new rural class that had been uplifted into a wealthy urban middle class still maintained their old world traditional sensibilities. And I think that the elites at that time underestimated how attached this new middle class was to these old sensibilities. I think the elites overextended their hand a bit, and they thought that bringing these peasants into the cities would help to reconstitute their outlook. And I believe this because you see in 1848, which is when the Biedermeier period ends. And by the way, this is particular to German areas, but I think that this kind of thing happened wherever a new urban middle class sprung up out of the rural flight, the Landflucht. No matter where that happened, I think that this type of sensibility was occurring. And that's why when the revolutions of 1848 happened, much of it failed. That's why I'm saying they overextended their hand. I think that because by the way, if you don't know anything about the revolutions of 1848, they were basically the first wave of socialist revolution. The first wave of liberal progressive ideology taking hold in Europe, and it happened so simultaneously, so in such a coordinated way all across Europe, that I have to assume that this was planned from above, planned from this new ruling elite. And much of it failed because, like I'm saying, because the new middle class that they had just created, that they thought, that they believed would help to execute this springtime of the peoples, this revolutionary wave, weren't as gung-ho, they weren't as enthusiastic about these new socialist ideals as they anticipated. And I'm just doing a very brief overview here. I'm assuming that you know a lot about history, and I'm not going to get too far into the details of like the revolutions of 1848. But it talks here about, for example, peasant grievances exploded during the revolutionary year of 1848, yet were often disconnected from urban revolutionary movements. So there is this divide between urban revolutionary figures that were into these new socialist ideals and the peasants who really didn't give a care about this new sort of vision of revolution and progress and equality and democracy. And I think a lot of those people were a part of this new middle class. They just hadn't gone along with this new program. They were still in the Biedermeier mindset. They wanted to be apolitical. They wanted to just enjoy their lives. They wanted to just take their walks in the park, live in their homely homes, have their little ceremonies and weddings and birthdays, and just live their life in peace. They weren't swept up by this fever, this revolutionary fever. And what happens immediately following the revolution, the mostly failed revolutions of 1848, were here. The World Expos. What Schwab calls the world's universities. The world in miniature. I believe the elites saw that this new middle class that they had just created were not going along with the program, and that a longer-term strategy had to be employed. They had to be educated. They had to have their consciousness shifted. They had to have a new framework of understanding who they were, understanding the overall trajectory of history, the end goal of civilization. They had to be brought on board. They had to be initiated. And the World's Fairs, as I'm going to read Schwab's words in just a second because I think he explained it extremely well. The World's Fairs were the mechanism by which they would initiate the new middle class, to take them from Biedermeier to modern, consumerist, liberal progressives. And also interesting, before I read Schwab's excellent article, also interesting was not only were the psyches of the average person being re-engineered by things like the World's Fairs, the very urban landscape was being re-engineered at this time through things like Haussmann's renovation of Paris and the Hobrecht Plan of Berlin. Right after these failed revolutions, massive scale urban renovations were taking place in Europe. You've got the Haussmann Plan in Paris, which happened in 1853, and the Hobrecht Plan, which began in 1862. And the whole purpose of these plans was to completely demolish and reconstruct the city centers of the major urban areas of Europe. To first of all divide the new middle class that would live in the city center from the lower working class that would work in factories at the periphery, at the edge of the cities, to push out the lower sort of irrelevant scum working class that was to be basically treated like slaves, push them out to the edges, to the peripheries, push the factories and all the industrial zones to the peripheries, and bring this new urban middle class into the center and give them a new urban environment to live in that would reflect the new ideology. This new urban environment would be scientifically determined. It would be rationally determined. It would be socialistic in a sense. They would be living in these large apartment blocks. The streets would all be open and wide, which also, by the way, the wide open streets and the linearity of the design. If you look at the designs, try to find a good overview. I know the German one gives a good overview. Linearity of the streets, and the width of the streets was conducive to the government in the sense that people would no longer be able to set up these barricades in the streets like they did before. You know, you look at the way that the streets were in Paris, for example, before the Haussmannization. You've got these narrow little corridors that were easy to barricade by small numbers of rebels. So, in many ways, the new urban plannings here, the barricade, talks about it there. The narrow streets were basically better for rebels, and they wanted to stop rebels now. They wanted to create an era of stability so that they could reconstitute, to reconstruct the mentalities of these people that had been uprooted, that had been deracinated. And literally the urban planning of the main cities was meant to correspond to that. So this happened both in Berlin and in Paris. And I think that what they wanted in this new urban middle class was an initiated group of people that would be the willing and enthusiastic participants in the new program going forward. They wanted a new managerial and a new administrative class for the mass, the mass man, for the mass workers that were being pushed to the peripheries. Okay, so all of this was happening at once. To just review for a second here before I read Schwab's article. You've got the flourishing of the secret societies. You've got the question of what were they planning? Well, I think they were planning a massive war. A moment of incredible chaos, incredible destruction that would create the conditions wherein a new society could be formed in its wake. So you've got the Napoleonic Wars just devastating Europe. Then you've got the period of relative peace and stability of the Biedermeier era. You've got the realization by the elites that the new Biedermeier middle class was not initiated yet properly into the new mindset that they wanted people to have. Then you have the failed revolutions of 1848, which I think ultimately proved that the new middle class was not ready yet. And following that, immediately you get extreme urban renovation of the major cities and the world expositions, the world's fairs. So let's read Schwab's words here on the world's fairs. The world's fairs functioned as apparatuses for conceptualizing and encompassing world system and value, a world system of value and power, and delineating subject positions within it. They were laboratories of global becoming, a space-time compression of the nascent cosmopolis. Hence, the use of slogans such as the world's university, the world in miniature. Entire urban centers were replanned to accommodate these mammoth spectacles. National economies damaged, wars postponed, and a whole lexicon of national symbols spun out of the ether. According to the historical record, these were the largest gatherings of people of all time, constituting the most popular and effective mass medium of the 19th century. The organic moral theater of America and the West in general was uprooted and replaced with, quote, meaningful displays of mass production, prefabrication, mass communications, and urbanization. It was at this time that the widespread understanding of Cyclopean architecture, 3 centuries of New World anthropology, knowledge of an unknown precursor race of larger-than-modern humanoids, and the primacy of scriptural history was completely demolished, to be replaced with Darwinism, the current imperial racial order, and the cult of industrialism. The idea that a race of physically superior humans had created an impressive civilization on par with anything in our world, an idea that matched scriptural history, the ethnographic records of nearly every indigenous tribe, copious physical evidence, and the universal acceptance of the physical and moral decline of man since Pliny the Elder. All of it needed to be ejected from the theater to make way for the new synthetic narratives. Quote, a World's Fair can be seen as one of a series of mammoth rituals in which all sorts of power relations, both existing and wished for, are being expressed. In this contest, all sorts of symbols are employed, and there are blatant efforts to manufacture tradition, to impose legitimacy. World's fairs gathered various aboriginals into theatrical villages to impress upon the observer the righteousness of the contemporary racial and class hierarchies, with the industrial societies of modern whites at the apogee as living testament to the power of their new gods, progress, electricity, and the machine. Quote, a fair was originally a holy day. The international exhibitions of the 19th century no longer had such overt religious associations, but the World's Fair itself assumed some characteristics of a quasi-religious celebration. Millions flocked to the exhibitions, as pilgrims once did to a holy place. The new pilgrims came to renew their faith in their own nations, to experience the miracles of science, to worship at the shrines of progress. Even the great exhibition halls, with their naves and transepts, were patterned after medieval cathedrals. These halls resounded with organ music, and they were sometimes called temples of industry. The Victorian age had a grand vision. For the first time, the earthly paradise was drawing near. More esoteric, granular distinctions between the races were homogenized into a cartoonish, monoculture version of whiteness and darkness that was meant to unify industrial workers and dissolve interracial tensions among European immigrants. This is important. As he says in just a second here, the modern sort of version or the modern narrative of the World's Fairs was that racism was like invented in the World's Fairs. But in reality, as Schwab says here, racial consciousness was drastically reduced by the World's Fairs. Europeans were, instead of, at the time there were many different local, regional differences that were seen as basically different races. They saw the French as a race, the Germans as a race, even the difference between Germans in the north versus Germans in the south. All these different little distinctions were they were beginning to be erased by lumping all of Europe and white civilization into a group. And they had all these little houses like the Norway house, the Germany house, the Spain house. They had these different houses to represent the different nations. But the subconscious fact that I think was absorbed by the audience was that, we have these different houses, but we're all part of one great race or one great organization that is unified by science, by industry, by progress. Let me just continue reading. It had nothing to do with empowering these proles, who would soon be returning to a dismal, soul-crushing existence. Modern scholars ahistorically declare race and racism was invented at these fairs, when in reality, racial consciousness was drastically reduced. Fairgoers were issued passports and given notebooks to record their indoctrination experience. The notion that these events were focused on entertainment is nowhere evidenced in the photographs of sullen attendees, dwarfed by the oversized grounds purposely built out of human scale. Commentators in 1851 expressed particular surprise at the seriousness of the event. As Humphrey Jennings noted, quote, "The fact is, the Great Exhibition is to them more of a school than a show. What was a matter of tedium, and ultimately became a mere lounge for gentlefolks, is used as a place of instruction by the people." Eventually, however, this mass indoctrination ritual became disguised as entertainment. By the time of the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, in May of 1893, P.T. Barnum was giving suggestions, quote, "Make it bigger, make it better than any that have preceded it. Make it the greatest show on earth, greater than my own great moral show, if you can." Another quote, The scale of technological advance was enough to mystify and enthrall the crowds. Into the 1870s, however, when exhibitions were becoming a norm throughout Europe, technology alone could no longer be relied upon to fill a site. In order to prevent disaster through non-attendance at these later events, organizers gave attention to popular entertainment. This grew as a dimension of exhibitions markedly during the 1880s until it came to be the dominant socio-economic factor on the site. In 1851, the only real elements identifiable specifically as mass entertainment, apart from refreshment facilities, were concerts given by orchestras and brass bands. By 1890, the situation had dramatically changed. By 1900, the entertainment side of the exhibitions had gained so much ground that education, commerce, and propaganda had to be disguised as pleasurable activities. The use of mass public rituals has always been the conventional method for consolidating power. Its grammar is well known. Public rituals had been thoroughly established during the Middle Ages, and eventually systematized into the cybernetic theater. Legitimating narratives and public psychodramas were a necessary measure for an increasingly degenerated and alienated elite. As late as the 19th century, there were a considerable number of cultural performances in which the elite participated as, for instance, weddings, funerals, religious services, national festivals, and so on. In Chicago in 1893, these articulations still appeared to be deeply rooted in mystical traditions and pagan theology. However, their messaging content was not particularly traditional. Rather, rituals and symbols developed by the court alchemists of monarchs were used to legitimize new mass social order. In order to demonstrate their power, the burgeoning managerial elite employed traditional rites of power to subdue the encroaching mass man. The worship of royalty was transformed into worship of the nation, into conditions in which the people worshipped themselves. According to W.R. Rydell, quote, "The fairs provided visitors with a galaxy of symbols, which cohered into symbolic universes. These constellations in turn ritualistically affirmed fairgoers' faith in American institutions and social organization, evoked a community of shared experience, and formulated responses to questions arising about the ultimate destiny of mankind in general, and of Americans in particular." The mass ritual function of the fairs was slowly transmuted into the Olympic Games, which the World's Fairs had revived or reinvented. As Burton Benedict has explained, quote, "The national competition element in World's Fairs was siphoned off by the Olympic Games. The second, third, and fourth Olympic Games were all held in conjunction with international expositions. Paris in 1900, St. Louis in 1904, London in 1908. The Olympics grew and began to take on the characteristics of World's Fairs. World's Fairs ceased to be the venue of important meetings and congresses. The bizarre imagery and esoteric symbolism of the Olympic ceremonies are now familiar to even the most incurious observer. But these performances are simply part of a tradition which finds its roots in the theatrics of the World's Fairs, and before that to the grand public ceremonies of ancient monarchs. It's an image of infant incubators. Infant incubators with living infants. There are many other bizarre factors surrounding the World's Fairs and that last Great Reset. The most salient is the control of children, which is manifest in the technical construction of modern public education, the strange epidemic of orphan children, and the even more bizarre presentation of unaccounted-for incubator babies as an attraction at many of the fairs and expositions. In today's grooming culture, the many efforts of globalist organizations and other oligarch proxies is to separate children from their parents. We see many parallels. Thorough prosecution of all these suspicious circumstances is beyond the scope of this article. So I think this is the last paragraph here that I'll read. The conversion into a society of Sodomic consumption was complete by the 1939 World's Fair. An economy based on unsatisfiable wants, not on need or product quality. So an economy based on unsatisfiable wants. That is exactly the opposite of what the Biedermeiers wanted. You know, they were still simple country folk brought into an upper middle class or urban middle class life. And the World's Fairs were what helped transform them. The world of tomorrow was primarily represented by merchandise, designed, produced, displayed, and distributed with no restraint and no borders. Edward Bernays, using the methods of mass psychology, worked with many of the corporations on their exhibits for the fair to promote a vision of democracy based on satisfying consumer needs as the truest form of patriotic duty. Plastics, automobiles, steel, and countless other industries were represented in elaborately designed display. The speed and scale of mass production had led to a loss of meaning, which Bernays would replace with a parallel consumer identity that derived meaning from the consuming of those goods at great speed and in quantities out of human scale. This closed loop has led to our current rat utopia, a Mobius strip impelled by onanastic? I don't know that word. I'm not familiar with this word. Of or pertaining to masturbation. Nice. A new word. A Mobius strip impelled by masturbatory inversions of human desire. This age is defined by the desperate phantom libido of the castrati, which decreases virility with every indulgence, but multiplies compulsions, recursively deforming the spirit, spawning a new host of ever more soul-shriveled, sexless homunculi. The spectacle of the technological sublime was intended to disadjust visitors from the contemporary world, not only by contrast with the primitive past, but also by immersing them in a sight that shifted proleptically into the future, a projection routinely envisioned as a borderless flow of capital along streamlined routes of electronic communication. So, that is the Great Reset. If you've been following along, I think you get it, but the timeline is planning done in the late 1700s by these top industrial elites. What were they planning? What were they aiming at? A Great Reset. Total chaos brought on by the Napoleonic Wars. Order out of chaos. A period of experimentation, of adjustment, of a new middle class. A failed attempt at a total coup, a total destruction of the old order in 1848. The attempt failed. A recollection, a new strategy formed, and the World's Fairs came out of it. That's the Great Reset of the 19th century. So, I'll let you guys stew on that for a second. I'm going to play a song, take a little break, because talking for an hour straight is... it's difficult. Let me play you another song. And I'll be right back, my friends. And I'll have a little Q&A. Chat with you guys for a bit.
Pack up all your dishes. Make note of all good wishes. And say goodbye to the landlord for me. That some bitches always bored me. Throw out them LA papers. Moldy box of vanilla wafers. Adios to all this concrete. Gonna get me some dirt road back street. If I can just get off of this LA freeway without getting killed or caught. Down that road in a cloud of smoke to some land I ain't bought, and you card in the mailbox. Leave the key in that old front door lock. They'll find it likely as not. I'm sure there's something we have forgot. Oh, Susanna, don't you cry, babe. Love's a gift that's surely handmade. We got something to believe in. Don't you think it's time we're leaving? If I can just get off of this LA freeway without getting killed or caught, down that road in a cloud of smoke to some land I ain't bought, and it's here's to you, old skinny Dennis. The only one I think I will miss. I can hear that old bass singing, sweet and low like a gift you're bringing. Play it for me one more time now. Got to give it all we can now. I believe everything you're saying, and just you keep on playing. If I can just get off of this LA freeway without getting
killed or caught
down that road
in a cloud of smoke to some land I ain't bought, and I can just get off of this LA freeway without getting killed or caught.
down that road.
Great song.
In a cloud of smoke to some land
I ain't bought. So what do you guys think?
all your wishes. Make note of all good wishes. Say goodbye to the landlord for me. Some bitches always bore me.
So you guys want to do a little Q&A? Or is it time to end the stream? What do you guys think? Any questions? Bormagny Leather Scraps, good to see you in the chat. Me Love You Journal asks, can you transform this into a video which I could download? Yeah, once it's done, I will make it public, and you'll be able to use like a YouTube to MP4 converter to download it if you wish. Parabot asks, have you ever heard of Alan Watt, Cutting Through the Matrix? A great man indeed. Yeah, he was a fellow that I basically introduced me into a lot of conspiratorial ideas. Aquila says, yes, he knows Alan's material very well and never credits him. If I accidentally what's the word? God, it's late. I've been talking a lot. If I accidentally plagiarize Watt, I apologize. It's if that's the case, it's because this was years ago that I consumed most of Watt's material, and it kind of just became background in my brain. And if there's any specific ideas that I've taken from him, full credit goes to him. Obviously, when I do these videos, I'm not trying to take credit from anybody. I'm just trying to get ideas out there and explain them in a way that makes sense, I guess, and put it into greater perspective, put it into different contexts. So, yeah, Watt's pretty good. He did a lot of good work. I'd recommend checking him out. Going back up the chat to see if anybody else has said anything. Men Like God says, so the World's Fairs were but a revitalization of the Judeo-Christian anima mundi. I can get behind that. I guess to some extent you could say that. But it was really not particular to Judeo-Christian. It was more of the alchemical, esoteric, or hermetic, Kabbalistic worldview that was being brought to the fore, because those occult religious worldviews, as I've talked about in the past, were all about using knowledge to gain control over reality and to collaborate with God in perfecting existence, to perfect the world and create through encyclopedic knowledge and control over nature via technology, a utopia, a heaven on earth, the kingdom of God on earth. John asks, what do you think of Dharma Nation's talk with Survive the Jive? I haven't seen it. I haven't watched much of Survive the Jive in a long while. Earl Turner says, Germ has been growing his magnificent forehead. The hair, there's a joke by a comedian. I forget who it was, but joke by a comedian who says, I'd rather have a receding hairline than a proceeding hairline that gets closer and closer to the eyebrows. But yeah, I definitely have a receding hairline. It won't be too long till I look like Stan Rogers. I hope that I get that pattern baldness of the hair around the horseshoe hair around the edges of the head. That's what I'm going for. Sportling says, the only things I hear about secret occult societies have been bad. Does anyone like these guys? Yeah, some people do. If you're a fan of the current world order, I mean, they would be seen as trailblazers, Men Like God's Kabbalism is both Judeo and Christian. I almost wrote Kabbalistic. LOL. It happens to the manliest of men. Yeah, that's the testosterone bumping out the hair. Bald at the front if you're a thinker. It's to absorb more sunlight. Powers the frontal lobe. Bald at the back if you're a lover. Oh, my 6-month-old son is bald at the back because of laying on his back, the back of his head. Parabot says, I'm sure Alan would be proud of your presentations. Also, I tip my hat to you, sir. Thank you. Appreciate that. Men who are bald at the back and the front, however, think they're lovers. Rat Trap says, will you write a book about all this stuff? I'd like to. There's just so much. I feel like a book would have to focus on one particular aspect because, unless I'm going to do what the old timers did and write like 7 volumes of history or 7 volumes of, there's just so much to get into. You have to sort of take it piecemeal. Didymus actually had a good point about this in one of his videos where he says, the wider the scale of history that you're trying to explain, the more difficult it is to actually have a meaningful theory about it because you're taking so many different elements into consideration. So I think if you take it piece by piece, that's the best way to do it. That's why I tried to focus only on the 19th century here. Because, there's a whole history that led up to the flourishing of the secret societies at the end of the 1700s. Schwab talks about this too in one of his articles where he talks about the the printing press and the popular literature that was promoted at the time, and this is in the Sardonic Gorgon, where he talks about the popular literature that was coming out at the time of the printing press and how it was being used to initiate some of these changes that we're talking about. Especially Richardson, for example, proto-feminist, who he says was the world's first novelist, an original tech bro, he calls it. Highly recommend Schwab's work. So, but to just focus on one particular century or one particular theme throughout history, it would be doable to write a book, but to try to, it would take a generation of intellectuals that were in agreement on the basic premises of the things that I'm talking about, that had a similar worldview to guys like Schwab or me. It would take a whole generation of intellectuals to rewrite history, to reframe history, so that we can understand it in a way that isn't basically propaganda for the current elite. Because that's what they did. It took them hundreds of years to establish an entire framework for understanding not just history, but every single subject. This is something I've talked about too, where I use the word consilience. To create a consilience of all the different subjects takes a long time and a lot of people working on it. Parabot says, in the past, a bald man was considered mature, and they welcomed that in the baldness. Yeah, I don't mind going bald. I'm not... a lot of people these days get really insecure about baldness. I don't mind it, as long as the beard never goes away. That I'm way more proud about my beard than the hair on my head. Didymus says, I agree. When you look at something like Gobineau to Houston Stewart Chamberlain to Rosenberg to Yawkey, it's a long time period and a transfer of ideas across time. And yes, there is a sense in which, like I said at the beginning, projects can last hundreds of years. And people who are at the height, at the pinnacle of not only intellectual prowess, but people who have vast resources at their fingertips. The dynastic quality of these people allows them to plan hundreds of years in advance, but the human element in it is such that you can't tell what your great-grandchild is going to think in a completely predetermined way. There's going to be differences in strategy. There's going to be differences in viewpoint, and there's subtle differences and factional divides and people who disagree on the best way to get to the end goal. And their history is not one secret cabal that's been leading in one direction the entire time. It's been sort of a caste. The way I conceive of it is it's a caste of people, like a biological strata of society, and these people more or less agree on the generalities of the big picture. They more or less agree on, but the ways that they want to get there, the particular niches that they get into, the particular paths that they want to lead society on, those all vary, those all differ, and there's disagreements, there's arguments, there's wars, there's conflicts, and all of that is interesting to me. But in general, I think it's important for people to realize that there has been, for hundreds of years now, this vision of the future that the elites have wanted to take us on, and that they are capable of grand projects, and they are capable of grand illusions and deceptions. And, the idea that a war like the Napoleonic Wars could be, in a sense, at some level, orchestrated on both sides by a single party, by a single hidden hand. That's something that people can't even fathom as a possibility. And I'm just saying it's possible. And if you make that assumption, a lot of other pieces fall into place, and it starts to look like, if this wasn't planned, if this wasn't a project or a plot, then wow, it all just worked out with divine providence in the favor of these industrial and financial international elites that were trying to destroy the old order of things. If it wasn't a project, if it wasn't in some sense orchestrated, then it must be the hand of God orchestrating things, and I refuse to believe that. So, Parabot says, history is his story, not truth and facts. Well, yeah, wasn't it Napoleon who said that history is just a collection of lies that have been agreed upon, or something like that? History is a set of lies that people have agreed upon. That's from the mouth of Napoleon. Men Like Gods recommends the work of Alexei Hrustalyov. I've never heard of him. I'm going to save his name right now. Can you name one of his works? Because I just Googled him, and nothing in particular seems to be coming up here. Didymus says, that's where some people see the Hegelian spirit in history, that steamroller which seems to be crushing everything which stands against it. Yeah. But to give an example of one random thing, it's kind of tangential, but found this interesting. There was a book, if I could find it in all these damn tabs that I have open, a book called the Count of Kabbalah, the Comte de Kabbalah. Where is it? I have so many damn tabs open. And according to Wikipedia, this was... So, it was about an occultist who explains the mysteries of the world to the author. It appeared in Paris in 1670 anonymously, though the identity of the author came to be known. It was read widely in France and abroad, and it is a source of many of the marvelous beings that populate later European literature. French readers include Baudelaire, Anatole France. It influenced Alexander Pope. In German, it is likely a source for Friedrich de la Motte's Undine. In recent times, it has been considered by some to have been intended as a satire of occult philosophy. So the modern spin on it is oh, it was a satire. But at the time, it was taken seriously. Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, took it seriously. Manly Palmer Hall, a great mystic and Freemason, took it seriously. Eliphas Levi took it seriously. Okay, so modern scholars look back on it, and I think they are struck by the revelations that were made in this. But so they try to spin it as saying, oh, this is just satire, this couldn't be taken seriously. But a lot of old occultists took this very seriously. And one of the interesting things that is revealed in this text is something that I've talked about in the past, something that Miles Mathis, for example, talks about, which is right here. Basically about feigned death. Here. Peradventure, while talking with God upon his flaming throne, he could not keep his glance from straying to his face. Now it is written that man may not behold God and live. Perhaps he merely pretended to die, as is the way of philosophers, who feign death in one place only to transplant themselves to another. And the footnote says, pretended death. When a philosopher has passed a certain number of years in service for the upliftment of humanity, having fulfilled the purpose of his soul upon incarnation, he earns the right to retire from the world and to enjoy the freedom demanded for his own spiritual evolution. In the order of the philosophers are enrolled the names of many brothers who have feigned death in one place or have mysteriously disappeared, only to transplant themselves to another. The burial place of St. Francis, or of Francis St. Alban, has never been divulged by those who know. Lord Bacon's death at the age of 65 is said to have occurred in the year 1626. It is significant that a rare print of John Valentine Andrea, a alchemist, author of a certain mystical tracts of profound influence in Germany, appears to be a portrait of Lord Bacon at 80 years of age, and bears a helmet, 4 roses, and the St. Andrew's cross, the arms of St. Alban's town. Within the past 100 years, a notable feigned death was that of Marshal Ney, a brother of the bravest of the brave, who lived for many years, and after his supposed execution in France, as a respected citizen of Rowan County in North Carolina. So this is, when they say philosopher, they just mean one of their brothers. They don't mean like Aristotle or whatever. The example that he gave was of a military commander. So he just means one of their ascended brothers, one of their initiates. Alleged survival records in South Carolina indicate the arrival of a Peter Stewart Ney the following year after Ney's execution. Ney's father was named Peter, and his mother's maiden name was Stewart. Peter Ney served as a schoolteacher in Rowan County until his death. So this old tome of occult knowledge openly reveals that it is common for their brothers, for their initiated brethren, to retire by feigning death and moving somewhere. It says here, Cagliostro, for example, supposedly died in prison only to pass the remainder of his life in the East. So you have to wonder, was someone like Jeffrey Epstein retired with a feigned death? How many people in recent history who were a part of the connected brethren, these secret clubs and societies of the elites, how many of them sort of finished their project, finished their role, and feigned death to retire somewhere? So that's just an example. I know I said it originally, it's a tangent, but that's just an example of the capacity of the elites to deceive and plan long term. See what else people have been saying. Men Like Gods followed up on Hrustalyov. He wrote one book in Hungarian, and to my knowledge, it has never been translated into English. There is one subtitled YouTube video, and a stolen history thread with its transcript and discussion. Cool. I'll search it out. Sig says, imagine being able to change bodies like a pair of socks. Oh. George Floyd. George Floyd was an ascended brother who was retired. He actually was a Freemason, by the way. So it is possible. It's just kind of goofy to think about. Big old. This is my George Floyd impression. I can't breathe. My big George Floyd lips. Well, St. George de Floyd. You put some respect on his name. It is Martin Luther King Day, after all. Heyoka says, history has been highly subverted, been going on for a long time. My great-uncle was a history professor in the early 1900s. He caught them in his time changing the books. GG User says, we need counter guilds and folkish organizations to oppose this stuff. Totally agree. And I think folks like us should be doing, like, we should be trying to do some viral things. I made a tweet the other day about an idea for like a viral TikTok video that would be in the style of like one of these goofy guys. See if I could find. I can't find it, but you know those stupid TikToks that, or shorts where somebody runs up to a random person and says, "For $5, who attacked us in Pearl Harbor?" Or "For $5, when was the Civil War?" So like very basic history, or like, for $5, how many states are there? For $5, how many continents are there? You know, and people don't know how to answer the question. They're stupid, so they can't answer the question. Do something like that, but have one of our guys run up to people, especially run up to like hipster-looking white people who are visibly liberal, visibly leftist. Run up to them and say something like, "For $10, are you glad that white people are being replaced?" And if they say yes, then you say something. You go, "Wrong answer," and you run away. Or you run up to them and say, "For $10, say Black Lives Matter." And if they say Black Lives Matter, then you say, "Wrong answer," and you run away. and you actually give the money to the person who doesn't say Black Lives Matter, or you give the money to somebody who says, no, I'm not happy that white people are being replaced. So it rewards people who are on our side, and it mocks people who, it makes them feel confused and weird, because if you're offering them money for a correct answer, then implicitly when you say that, no, that's not right, and you run away with the money, they get kind of confused and baffled by, they thought this was the right answer, they should get the money. I don't know. Just ideas like that, where it's very surface level, very, it's really stupid actually in its appeal, but it gets sort of our ideas out there. That would be interesting to me. Zed Dez says, caught a bit of Jay Dyer earlier today, and he mentioned visiting the library of his alma mater and finding that most of the best tomes had been removed from the shelves. Man, all libraries are like that. I bring my daughter to the local library, and I am not exaggerating when I say almost all of the children's books that are put in like the prominent places where kids are going to see it and look are all about brown people, black people, trans people, gay people. It's insane. Zed asks, have you read this? The Occult Technology of Power. The Initiation of the Son of a Finance Capitalist into the Arcane Secrets of Economic and Political Power Underworld Amusements. Wow, what a long title. That's like an old Fall Out Boy song title. I have not read it, but I'm searching it now so I can... Looks interesting. Maybe I'll buy it. There's a free audiobook, it looks like, on Amazon. I've got like 4 Audible credits, so maybe I'll use one and buy it. I got a friend to ask a high-level legal representative of the government about the system. All she would answer is, they sold us a lemon. So yes, we've been hijacked. Zed says you can get the PDF for free too. Cool. Pete Wentz wrote that book. Well, fellas, I've been on now for how long? Almost 2 hours. And I think I'm going to call it a night. Appreciate you all coming. On my I'm going to do another stream soon, but I want to figure out, for these longer streams, I want to figure out a way to get people on easily, for either like a call-in or like a co-host video chat. I'd like to do it in like an easy way where I could chat with someone for 5-10 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, and then get somebody else on and sort of do like an old-fashioned radio call-in show. So I'm going to be looking into that, figuring out a way to do that easily. But hope you guys are all doing well in this new year of 2023. And hope to see you again soon. I really appreciate you all showing up even after my long absences. So, take care, everybody, and have a good night. See you next time.